Welcome to PRAJNA SPARKS Special Series 59 Days of Healing, where we explore one maxim from the Tibetan Lojong text, 7 points for healing dualistic mind, each day, to integrate the practice into our lives. Today is day 45, and we are in the midst of point 7, tips. Maxim 45 reads, embrace the 3 efficient causes. What is an efficient cause, first of all? The Buddha always teaches in cause and result, and in this case, we're talking about efficient causes. And it's pretty much what it sounds like, that factor that immediately produces a result. So what are the 3 efficient causes that this maxim, the second in the quartet of threes, is talking about? There's lots of different ways that commentaries explain these 3 efficient causes, but usually they end up being about very specific things. In particular, they relate to causes that are efficient in producing a movement in our spiritual development towards manifesting our true nature. The 3 efficient causes in the commentaries that I use for this practice are, first, a spiritual friend. Now, this can be a guru, a master of meditation. It could be a teacher in your local Dharma center, a fellow practitioner, basically someone who does exactly what that name sounds like, befriends you on the spiritual path, helping us and mentoring us as we engage in the practice. This is someone who can support us with questions or lead us in the right direction, give us guidance, and so forth. In addition to a spiritual friend, the second efficient cause is a mind that's supple, our own mind, workable and supple enough that we can engage in listening, contemplating, and meditating on the spiritual teachings so that we integrate the Buddha's teachings into our lives. One of the reasons why a human existence is so priceless is because of the human mind. In fact, you could say that is the primary reason. It's a mind that is able to reason. It can take in material. It can really examine it intellectually, and it can integrate it experientially. So this supple mind that's workable has managed to heal enough to be able to engage the Dharma without rampant distraction is the second efficient cause. If we have a spiritual teacher and a supple mind, what else could we possibly need? The third efficient cause is the set of harmonious conditions that help us support our life of practice. This is sufficient food, clothing, shelter, and so forth. Basically, the essentials for survival, but not just bare survival, and also not extravagant lifestyle. A quantity of food, clothing, and shelter that is sufficient to give us comfort, warmth, and shelter without causing a lot of aggravation if we're too hungry or too cold, and also not going to such excess that we fall into complacency. If you're listening to this podcast, you have a mind supple enough to listen, contemplate, and meditate on the Buddha Dharma. More than likely, you also have the privilege of sufficient food, clothing, and a home that permits you to engage in spiritual practice. If you also have a spiritual teacher, then you've got the full set of 3 efficient causes for progress on the spiritual path. Fabulous. Congratulations.
Well, I am very fortunate because it is true. I have harmonious conditions. I have a mind supple enough to both listen to and help to create this podcast. But I also have a spiritual friend and she's right here with me. So I am extraordinarily fortunate. I was wondering if you would consider your role to listeners as a spiritual friend, or is there a stronger connection needed? Like what's important in that relationship?
Oh, I'm very grateful for that question because nowadays it's very easy to think of folks as your teacher because you watch them on YouTube or read their books. And there's definitely a very important sense in which anyone that you're engaging in learning the Dharma from is your teacher. This is talking about a spiritual friend, Kalyana Mitra, which is really a little bit more. It's a one-on-one connection. And different traditions will have different ways that that plays out. In the Kagyu lineage, it's really meant to be a very close connection. So, for example, one of the ways I work with people in that context is in private sessions of spiritual counsel, or sometimes in very short-term kinds of settings during a retreat or Dharma teaching at a center where I have an interview with somebody. This kind of connection where you can go back to the spiritual friend and check in along the way. That's what this is talking about. Not so much someone that you engage with on the page or on a screen alone, although that might be part of it, but someone that you can go back to and continue to have the instructions for practice expanded. Traditionally, we don't actually get a lot of instructions, mostly because the human mind is such that we complicate absolutely everything. So the more information we have about the instructions, the more we complicate them. Historically, the instructions were very basic. Do this, go and meditate, come back when you're done. And then the next piece comes. And that kind of back and forth is a beautiful kind of spiritual intimacy that is meant to support the student, empower the student, and not abuse that power relationship so that the student can grow and progress with safety, comfort, and reliance on someone who's got their back.
And that really resonates for me as a psychologist as well, because in order to support someone in their growth, it does take a specific kind of relationship that has a closeness and also has some boundaries to it. And so that's very helpful. But one of the things we know from research into therapy is that therapeutic relationship is actually the most important component of all of those things that happen in therapy. I think that makes a lot of sense, that it's not just about whose teachings are you paying attention to, but about having someone accompanying you along that journey who you can really entrust to offer you guidance.
Boundaries are very important, just as there should be no abuse of power from the side of the teacher. It's also really important that neither the teacher nor the student infantilizes the student. We have our own power, and this relationship is meant to allow us to step into and inhabit that space. If we give up our power or we expect someone to be tending to our every need, then that can also be an unhealthy thing. Another way of putting that is we don't have any less responsibility for ourselves with a spiritual friend. And at the same time, that teacher retains 100% responsibility for any abuse of power. 50% us, 100% teacher. The beauty of the spiritual friendship is that it can sometimes bring up those habitual tendencies that we need to work on. And so sometimes that spiritual friendship can be a little bit fraught because it brings up some of the projections, some of the material that we haven't quite metabolized yet in our emotional history. With that appropriate balance on both the side of the teacher and the student, like in a therapeutic relationship, that material can be brought to the surface so that it can be processed in a healthy, vital way that supports our further growth.
I also appreciate this aspect of the harmonious conditions that you talked about, that it needs to be good enough. We don't need to have everything completely perfectly in place. You know, if we don't have precisely the right cushion to sit on, or if you haven't bought yourself, a new mala recently, like that shouldn't stand in the way of our spiritual practice, that there's a sort of level of it that's sufficient. And I think that that's just a good foundation to have. I think that we can sometimes be in the business of acquiring lots of things to support our practice. And so I appreciate the way that you put that.
our culture is a very materialistic one, and that tendency can seep into all kinds of aspects of our life, but spiritual practice is certainly one of them. Tibetan practice that I'm a part of is incredibly good at triggering that. There are so many literal bells and whistles that you use in ritual practice. When I was preparing for 3-year meditation cloister, there were so many things I had to buy in these little alleyways and tiny dark stores in Bodhanath and Nepal that I called the list the Harry Potter list. It looked just like the kids in the Harry Potter movies before they go to Hogwarts and they have to go and buy their wand and their this and their that. There's a lot of stuff. It's not those material things that are critical. One wonderful example is it's very common practice in Tibetan Buddhist ritual to lay out offerings on your personal altar. You can get really elaborate about those things, but the custom is to use water. Water is pretty much everywhere so far. Wonderful way to have a physical support for the offering. But the water is so simple. We tend not to be very attached to it. So the emphasis shifts to the attitude, the mindset with which we're offering. And another point that you make reminds me of a Tibetan word. The Tibetan word that I usually translate as contentment is made up of the words knowing and enough. Contentment is knowing what's enough. Knowing this is enough.
Well, and we are made up largely of water. So just the whole us and another thing, dualism, maybe that helps us to overcome it too.
It does. And another thing I want to point out with the harmonious conditions that I didn't include in the listing because it's not the basics, our Sangha, our community, and that could be a large group of people at our Dharma center, or it could be other people we know who are practicing, or if we're in a retreat setting, everybody who's in the group practicing. We are the conditions for other people, as well as being on the receiving end of conditions that support us, particularly when we're in the setting of a group practice or retreat setting. It's really vital that we not discourage or take folks away from the practice and see ourselves as conditions that are harmonious for others. Kind of like we're all in a greenhouse and we want to encourage each other's growth. If we go and open the window and let the freezing air in by disrupting that greenhouse atmosphere, then we're hurting everyone. It's really important, even when we're looking at lists like this that seem very much to be saying this is what's right and that's what's wrong. Even then, it's important to try to loosen up that habit of seeing things too strictly and too dualistically, and to experiment with looking at each of these pieces from many different angles and getting a much more multidimensional understanding of what they're about. That's a great way to work with this maxim on days that it comes up.
We are receiving the harmonious conditions and we're creating them for other people.
Precisely.
This has been Yeshe and Tanya on day 45 of PRAJNA SPARKS special series, 59 Days of Healing. Tune in daily for more maxims from the Tibetan Lojong text, 7 Points for Healing Dualistic Mind. Check the episode notes for more resources. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at PRAJNA SPARKS, and email us, sparks@prajnafire.com, with any questions. May all beings benefit.